Shadows of Derby Lane, a Detective Shernan investigation content warning. This program contains descriptions of violence, crime scenes, and sensitive content that may not be suitable for viewers under 18. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Legal disclaimer. All names, specific locations, and identifying details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved. This documentary is based on true events, but certain aspects have been modified for privacy and legal reasons. Introduction opening shot. Aerial view of Derby cityscape at dusk. Streetlights flickering on as darkness creeps across neighborhoods. Camera pans down to a rain-slicked street with police cars, their lights casting eerie blue and red patterns against brick buildings. I've always believed that the darkest shadows hide the most illuminating truths. That's where I've spent most of my career, in those shadows, searching for answers that others couldn't find, or perhaps more accurately, didn't want to find. My name is Detective Marcus Shernan. For 26 years, I've specialized in what the department euphemistically calls challenging investigations. The cases that haunt precinct corridors and keep detectives awake at night. The unsolved ones. The cases that refuse to die. Camera focuses on Detective Shernan sitting in a dimly lit office, case files scattered across a desk. He looks directly at the camera, his weathered face telling its own story of decades spent pursuing justice. The case I'm about to share with you has consumed 5 years of my life. It's changed me in ways I'm still coming to understand. When I first received the call on that rainy November evening in 2018, I couldn't have imagined how deep this particular rabbit hole would go, or how it would connect to a web of secrets spanning nearly 2 decades. What began as a seemingly straightforward missing persons case in a quiet suburb of Derby would eventually unravel into something far more sinister. A case involving multiple disappearances, a network of deception, and a killer who had been hiding in plain sight, walking the same streets as their victims for years. Body camera footage plays. A first-person view walking through a rain-drenched path between houses. Flashlight beam cutting through darkness, illuminating a garden shed with its doors slightly ajar. I'm taking you inside this investigation not just to show you how we finally brought justice to the victims and their families, but because I believe there are lessons here that might save lives. As you listen to this story, I want you to ask yourself, would you have noticed the warning signs? Would you have seen what was happening before it was too late? Because the most terrifying truth I've learned in my career is this: monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like neighbors, friends, co-workers. They look like people you trust. Camera returns to Shernan, who leans forward, his expression grave. This is the story of the Derby Lane disappearances, a case that remained unsolved for over 15 years until a single, seemingly insignificant detail changed everything. This is a story about how evil can exist in the quietest places, and how sometimes justice demands that we look into the darkness until our eyes adjust and we can finally see what's been there all along. Ask yourself as we go through this journey together, what would you have done? How well do you really know the people in your life? Welcome to the shadows. Let me be your guide. Part 1. The disappearances archival footage. News reports from 20,032,005 showing 3 different missing persons cases. When 23-year-old Eliza Morgan disappeared from her apartment on Hawthorne Street in 2003, it barely made the evening news. Young women sometimes leave without warning. They start new lives, escape bad relationships, follow new opportunities. At least, that's what everyone wanted to believe. 14 months later, Natalie Wells vanished after a night out with friends at the Crown and Anchor pub. Her purse was found in an alley 2 blocks away, her phone and keys still inside. There was more media coverage this time, more community concern, but still, the case eventually grew cold. Then, in early 2005, 30-year-old Charlotte Davies disappeared while walking home from her late shift at Mercy Hospital. Her scrubs and identification badge were found near Derwent Park, but Charlotte was gone without a trace. 3 women, 3 disappearances. No bodies, no resolution. Camera shows Shernan walking through an evidence room, pulling out dusty case files labeled cold case with the women's names. I wasn't assigned to any of these cases initially. They'd been handled by various detectives, some of whom had since retired or transferred. By the time I became involved in 2018, these women had been missing for over a decade. Their families had lived in a terrible limbo, unable to mourn properly, unable to move on, trapped in the purgatory of not knowing. Interview footage. An elderly woman with silver hair arranged neatly, sitting in a floral-patterned living room. Caption: Margaret Wells, Natalie's mother. The not knowing is the worst part. Is she alive somewhere? Is she suffering? Or is she gone? Every time the phone rings, even after all these years, there's this tiny part of me that thinks it might be her. I just want to know what happened to my daughter. Camera returns to Shernan, now standing at a large evidence board covered with photos, timelines, and maps. Let me take you back to November 2018, when everything changed. Emma Richardson, 27 years old, went missing from her home in the Litchurch area of Derby. Her boyfriend, James Fletcher, reported her missing after she failed to return from a late-night trip to the nearby convenience store. Body camera footage. Officers entering Emma Richardson's apartment. The camera pans across a normal-looking living room, a half-empty cup of tea on the coffee table, a novel splayed open face down on the sofa, a cardigan thrown over a chair. The initial investigation was by the book. Uniformed officers took statements from the boyfriend, neighbors, family members. They searched the area and reviewed CCTV footage from nearby businesses. The case was treated as a priority missing person, but at that point, there was nothing to suggest foul play. Split screen. Emma Richardson's DMV photo next to images of the 3 older missing women. I want you to look carefully at these 4 women. At first glance, they might seem quite different. Different ages, different occupations, different circumstances around their disappearances. But my years as a detective have taught me to look for patterns where others might not see them. All 4 women were of similar height and build. All had shoulder-length brown hair. All disappeared within a 3-mile radius in Derby. And most importantly, all 4 vanished without struggle, without witnesses, without leaving significant physical evidence behind. I believe in coincidences. But 4 similar women disappearing from the same area over 15 years? That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. Camera shows Shernan reviewing CCTV footage, squinting at grainy black and white images. When I reviewed the security footage from the convenience store Emma Richardson supposedly visited, something immediately struck me as odd. She never arrived. Not at the time her boyfriend claimed she'd left their apartment, not at any time that evening. The timestamp on their apartment building's security cameras showed Emma leaving at 11:23 p.m. The convenience store was a 7-minute walk away. She should have appeared on their cameras by 11:30. She never did. Shernan walking along the route Emma would have taken, pointing out security camera locations. I walked this route several times during different times of day and night. There are blind spots, of course, stretches where no cameras would have captured her movements. But here's the key question I kept asking myself. If Emma never made it to the convenience store, where did she go instead? And why? Footage of Shernan interviewing James Fletcher in an interrogation room. James Fletcher struck me as genuinely concerned about Emma's disappearance. He cooperated fully, provided alibi information that checked out, and demonstrated real distress during our interviews. But something about his story didn't add up. She said she was going to get some paracetamol for a headache, he told me during our 3rd interview. She'd been complaining about it all evening. But when we searched the apartment, we found a nearly full package of paracetamol in their medicine cabinet. When I confronted James with this fact, his explanation was plausible enough. Maybe she didn't know we had some. I had just bought them the day before. Still, it nagged at me. So I dug deeper into James's background, and something unusual emerged. Computer screen showing database search results. James Fletcher had moved to Derby in late 2002, about 6 months before Eliza Morgan's disappearance. He'd lived within a quarter-mile of each disappearance site, and most interestingly, he'd been briefly questioned in the Natalie Wells case because he'd been at the Crown and Anchor the night she vanished. He'd been cleared quickly. Multiple witnesses confirmed he'd left the pub hours before Natalie, and CCTV showed him entering his flat building at the time in question. These connections weren't enough to make him a suspect. They were circumstantial, coincidental, but they were enough to make me curious. Shernan standing outside an unassuming brick house. What really caught my attention, though, was James's childhood home, this modest house on Derby Lane where he'd grown up and where his elderly mother still lived. The house sat almost exactly in the geographical center of all 4 disappearances. And Derby Lane itself was interesting, a quiet residential street that connected several main roads, providing easy access to different parts of the city. I decided to look more closely at this seemingly unremarkable street, and that's when I made the first real breakthrough in these cases. Close-up of Shernan reviewing property records. Property records showed that a house 3 doors down from the Fletcher family home had been vacant between 2000 and 2007. The owner, a Harold Wainwright, had moved to Australia but kept the property as an investment. The utilities had been shut off, and according to neighbors, the place had sat empty for those 7 years, or so everyone thought. Shernan interviewing an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Hobbs. "Now that you mention it, I did see lights there occasionally," Mrs. Hobbs told me. "I assumed it was estate agents showing the place, or perhaps Mr. Wainwright had arranged for someone to check on it periodically. It wasn't frequent enough to make me think anyone was living there." When I asked if she'd ever seen anyone entering or leaving the property during those years, her answer sent a chill down my spine. Once or twice, perhaps. A man, I think. But it was always at odd hours, and my eyesight wasn't what it used to be. I couldn't tell you what he looked like. I obtained a warrant to search the no-occupied property. The current owners, a young family with no connection to our cases, had purchased it in 2008 and renovated it extensively. Any physical evidence that might have existed was long gone, but I wasn't ready to give up on this lead. I arranged to interview Harold Wainwright via video call. Video conference screen showing an elderly man with sunburned skin against a backdrop of Australian coastline. "I hired a property management company to look after the place," Wainwright explained. "They were supposed to check on it monthly and handle any maintenance issues. When I contacted the property management company, they had no record of any unusual activity. According to their logs, the house had remained secure and unoccupied throughout their management period. I was at an impasse. Then a colleague made a suggestion that would prove crucial. Have you checked the utility records? Even in a vacant property, there might be minimal usage. Close-up of water usage records spanning several years. The electricity and gas records showed nothing unusual, minimal usage consistent with an empty house. But the water records told a different story. While usage was generally very low, there were periodic spike days when water consumption jumped significantly before returning to baseline. These spikes occurred approximately every 2 to 3 months from 2003 to 2005. The dates of 3 of these spikes aligned almost perfectly with the disappearances of Eliza Morgan, Natalie Wells, and Charlotte Davies. Shernan standing in the kitchen of the house, now inhabited by the new owners. Standing in this ordinary kitchen, I couldn't help but imagine what might have happened here years ago. Had this house been used to hold the missing women? Had they been brought here, perhaps alive, perhaps not? The water usage spikes suggested that someone might have needed to clean up something extensive. But we still had no bodies, no direct evidence linking these disappearances to the vacant house, and no clear suspect. The current homeowners allowed us to bring in forensic teams to search for traces of blood or other evidence, but after multiple renovations and more than a decade of new occupancy, nothing conclusive was found. I began to wonder if we'd ever find the truth. Shernan at his desk, looking exhausted, surrounded by case files. For weeks, I went back through every detail of the 4 disappearances. I re-interviewed everyone who was still available: family members, friends, former colleagues of the missing women. I was looking for something, anything, that might have been missed. Every detective knows that cold cases often break on the smallest details, the things that seemed insignificant at the time, but take on new meaning with fresh perspective or additional information. Close-up of Shernan's hand holding a photograph of Natalie Wells, and then I found it. In Natalie Wells's case file, there was a statement from her roommate that had been largely overlooked. Natalie mentioned that she'd been seeing someone new, but she was being very secretive about it. She wouldn't even tell me his name, just said he was complicated and that they needed to keep things quiet for a while. A secret relationship. It wasn't much, but it was something. I went back and reviewed the other case files with this in mind. Split screen showing excerpts from different witness statements. Eliza Morgan's sister had mentioned that Eliza had been acting differently in the weeks before her disappearance, distracted, checking her phone constantly, smiling at private jokes. Charlotte Davies' co-worker at the hospital noted that Charlotte had received flowers twice in the month before she vanished, but had been evasive about who sent them. And most recently, Emma Richardson's best friend told us that Emma had been unusually secretive about where she was going on certain evenings. James, her boyfriend, had assumed she was working late, but her workplace had no record of overtime during those periods. A pattern was emerging. All 4 women may have been involved in secretive relationships or meetings before their disappearances. But with whom? Shernan walking along Derby Lane, the camera following behind him as he narrates. The vacant house on Derby Lane seemed to be at the center of it all, but who had access to it? The property management company employed several people, and their records of who visited the property when were incomplete at best. I needed a connection, something that tied everything together. And that's when I decided to look more closely at not just James Fletcher, but his entire family. Computer screen showing search results for Fletcher family Derby. James had 1 sibling, a younger brother named Oliver Fletcher, born 4 years after James. Oliver had moved away from Derby in his early 20s and now lived in Edinburgh, or so it appeared. Shernan on the phone, his expression changing as he listens. When I contacted authorities in Edinburgh to arrange an interview with Oliver, they informed me that he had left the city 3 years earlier. His last known address was a flat he'd vacated in 2015, leaving no forwarding address. Where had Oliver Fletcher gone? And why was his brother James unaware of or lying about his whereabouts? Shernan returns to interview James Fletcher. I haven't spoken to Ollie in years, James told me, looking genuinely uncomfortable. We had a falling out after our father died. He blamed me for some family issues. Last I heard, he was in Scotland somewhere. When I pressed him about the exact nature of their falling out, James became evasive. It was personal, family stuff. I'd rather not get into it. I decided it was time to speak with the 1 remaining Fletcher family member, Margaret Fletcher, the elderly mother still living in the original family home on Derby Lane. Part 2. The Fletcher family footage of a modest brick house with neatly kept garden. Shernan approaches and knocks on the door. An elderly woman answers, initially smiling, then becoming more guarded as Shernan identifies himself. Margaret Fletcher was 78 years old when I first interviewed her. A retired school teacher, she'd lived in the same house for over 40 years, raising her 2 sons there after her husband left when the boys were still young. Interview footage of Margaret Fletcher in her living room. The walls are covered with family photos. My boys were everything to me, she told me, serving tea in delicate china cups that looked as fragile as she did. Being a single mother wasn't easy back then, but we managed. James was always so protective of Oliver. Like a second father, really. I asked her about Oliver's current whereabouts. Oh, he travels a lot for his work. IT consulting, very complicated. He calls now and then, sends postcards. She gestured vaguely toward a sideboard where a few postcards stood propped against a lamp. Close-up of postcards showing various European cities, Barcelona, Amsterdam, Prague. The handwriting is neat. The message is brief and impersonal. "When did you last see him in person?" I asked. Her hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Christmas before last, I believe. Or was it the one before that? My memory isn't what it used to be." Something about her demeanor made me suspect she was being less than truthful, but I didn't press her then. Instead, I asked about the vacant house down the street during the early 2000s. "Oh, poor Mr. Wainwright's place. Yes, it sat empty for years. Such a shame. Property values, you know. Did you ever notice anyone going in or out of the house during that time?" Another hesitation. "I don't recall." As I said, my memory. I showed her photographs of the 4 missing women. "Do any of these women look familiar to you, Mrs. Fletcher?" She studied them carefully, or appeared to. "No, I don't believe so." "Should they?" Shernan narrating as he drives away from the Fletcher house. I left that first interview with more questions than answers. Margaret Fletcher had been polite, but guarded. Something about her responses felt rehearsed, as if she'd been prepared for someone to come asking questions eventually. I decided to dig deeper into Oliver Fletcher's history, and what I found was disturbing. Computer screen showing school records and police reports. Oliver had been a troubled child. There were records of concerning behavior at school, cruelty to animals, conflicts with teachers, trouble maintaining friendships. At 15, he'd been questioned about a small fire set in a neighbor's shed, though no charges were filed due to insufficient evidence. Then, at 19, he was arrested for stalking a female classmate at university. The case resulted in a restraining order, but no criminal conviction after the young woman decided not to pursue charges. After that, his record was clean, at least on paper. He'd graduated with a degree in computer science and worked a series of short-term IT contracts, moving frequently. The official record painted a picture of someone who might have outgrown his troubled youth, but my instincts told me otherwise. I obtained warrants to access Oliver's financial records, phone records, anything that might help track his movements over the years. What emerged was a pattern of a man who seemed to exist on the periphery, limited social media presence, prepaid phones that changed frequently, short-term rentals rather than permanent addresses. Shernan standing before a complex timeline mapped on a wall. The picture became clearer when I overlaid Oliver's known movements with the dates of the disappearances. While there wasn't enough for a conviction, there was a pattern Oliver had been in Derby around the time each woman vanished. Credit card records showed purchases in local shops. Mobile phone towers had picked up his signal. And then there was the most disturbing connection of all, close-up of hospital employment records. Oliver Fletcher had worked as an IT contractor at Mercy Hospital, the same hospital where Charlotte Davies had worked as a nurse for 3 months leading up to her disappearance. He'd left the position abruptly, just days after she vanished. Shernan interviewing a hospital administrator. He was quiet, kept to himself, the administrator recalled. Did his job well enough, but didn't socialize much with the staff. I remember being surprised when he quit without notice. We had to scramble to find a replacement. When I asked if she'd ever observed any interaction between Oliver and Charlotte, she thought for a moment. Not specifically, but IT people go everywhere in the hospital. They have access to all departments, all computer systems. He would have had plenty of opportunities to cross paths with her. I was building a circumstantial case against Oliver Fletcher. But I still had no definitive proof, no bodies, and no idea where Oliver currently was. That's when I decided to employ a strategy that was somewhat unorthodox. Shernan speaking directly to camera. I want to pause here and ask you, the viewer, what would you do in this situation? You have strong suspicions about someone's involvement in multiple disappearances, but not enough evidence for an arrest. The suspect has effectively vanished. How would you draw them out? Shernan meeting with his superior, Chief Inspector Wilson, in an office. I want to use James to get to Oliver, I explained to Chief Inspector Wilson. I believe James knows more than he's telling us, whether he's protecting his brother consciously or not. You think James is involved? Wilson asked skeptically. I'm not sure. But at minimum, I think he has information he doesn't realize is significant. And I think if we pressure him, it might reach Oliver through their mother. Wilson was hesitant but ultimately approved my plan. We would bring James in for more intensive questioning. Let it be known we were investigating a potential connection between the disappearances and the Fletcher family, and see what ripples it created. Footage of James Fletcher being questioned in an interrogation room. He looks increasingly distressed. I've told you everything I know about Emma's disappearance, James insisted, running his hands through his hair in frustration. I don't understand why you keep bringing me back here. We're exploring all possibilities, James, I told him calmly, including connections between Emma's case and several others dating back to 2003. His expression changed subtly: confusion, perhaps concern. What other cases? What does that have to do with Emma? I laid photographs of all 4 missing women on the table. These women all disappeared under similar circumstances, all within a few miles of your family home on Derby Lane. We've discovered evidence suggesting your brother Oliver might have information relevant to our investigation. James stared at the photographs, his face paling. This is insane. Ollie? No way. He wouldn't. He couldn't. When did you last speak with your brother, James? He hesitated, and I knew immediately he'd been lying about their estrangement. A few months ago, maybe? We don't talk often. Where is he now? I don't know exactly. Traveling for work, last I heard. I leaned across the table. James, if you're protecting your brother, you need to understand what you might be complicit in. 4 women are missing. Their families have been suffering for years. If you know anything at all about Oliver's movements or activities, now is the time to tell us. James looked genuinely torn. I need some time to think. Can I go now? I've told you all I know. We had no grounds to hold him, so I let him leave. But I had officers discreetly follow him. Surveillance footage showing James Fletcher walking quickly down the street, repeatedly checking his phone. As soon as he left the station, James made a call. The officers couldn't hear the conversation, but his body language suggested urgency, agitation. He then went directly to his mother's house on Derby Lane, where he remained for nearly 2 hours. When he emerged, he returned to his own apartment and didn't leave again that day. Shernan at his desk, reviewing surveillance photos. I knew we'd stirred something up, but I didn't know exactly what. Had James warned his brother? Was he genuinely shocked by our questions? Was he a knowing accomplice or an unwitting pawn? The next morning, I decided to pay another visit to Margaret Fletcher. Footage of Shernan approaching the Fletcher house again. This time, Margaret opens the door before he knocks. She looks as if she hasn't slept. I suppose you'd better come in, she said quietly. The living room was exactly as it had been during my previous visit, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Margaret's hands trembled as she lowered herself into an armchair without offering tea this time. James came to see you yesterday, I said. It wasn't a question. Yes, her voice was barely audible. What did he tell you, Mrs. Fletcher? She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, perhaps relief. He told me you're looking at Oliver in connection with some missing women. And what did you say to that? A tear slid down her lined cheek. I told him it was impossible, that Oliver couldn't have done such things, that you were making a terrible mistake. Do you believe that, Mrs. Fletcher? Her silence was answer enough. How long have you suspected? I asked gently. She stared at her hands, now folded tightly in her lap. I didn't suspect. Not really. I just worried. Mothers worry, you know. What did you worry about specifically? Oliver was always different. As a child, He had trouble with emotions, with understanding how other people felt. The doctors said he'd grow out of it, but she trailed off, lost in painful memories. Did something specific happen to make you worry about these disappearances? She looked up sharply. I never said I connected Oliver to those poor women, but you did, didn't you? Perhaps not consciously, but some part of you made the connection. Another long silence filled the room. Finally, she spoke again, her voice steadier. There was a cellar in Mr. Wainwright's house. Did you know that? Most of the houses on this street don't have them. They were built without. But his was different, older. I felt a chill run through me. Go on. Oliver used to play there as a boy. Mr. Wainwright let him use it as a sort of clubhouse before he moved away. Oliver kept a key. I found it among his things once and asked him about it. He said, Mr. Wainwright had told him he could check on the house sometimes. I thought it was nice of him to take an interest. When was this? Oh, years ago. When Oliver was still living at home, before he moved away for university. Did you ever see Oliver going to that house after Mr. Wainwright moved to Australia? She shook her head slowly. Not that I recall, but then I wouldn't necessarily have noticed. It's just down the street, after all. I leaned forward. Mrs. Fletcher, do you know where Oliver is now? She hesitated, then reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew a slip of paper. He called me last night. After James left, he said he was going away for a while and not to worry. He gave me this address where he said he'd be staying. He told me not to tell anyone, but her voice broke. If he's done something terrible, I just can't protect him anymore. Close-up of the paper, an address in a remote part of the Peak District. Thank you for doing the right thing, Mrs. Fletcher, I said, taking the paper. I know this isn't easy. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. If Oliver has hurt those women, if he's done what you think, I need you to know that I never saw it. I never knew. What kind of mother doesn't see something like that in her own child? I had no answer for her. In my years as a detective, I've learned that people can be remarkably skilled at hiding their true natures, even from those closest to them. Or perhaps especially from those closest to them, who have the most invested in not seeing the darkness. Shernan briefing a tactical team, pointing at maps of the Peak District location. Within hours, we had a team assembled to investigate the address Margaret had provided. It was a remote cottage, accessible only by a single narrow road, surrounded by moorland. The property had been purchased 3 years earlier by a shell company that, with some investigation, we were able to link back to Oliver Fletcher. He had gone to considerable lengths to obscure his ownership, suggesting he had something significant to hide. As we prepared to move in, I felt the weight of 15 years of unanswered questions. Would we finally find the truth about what happened to these 4 women? And if Oliver was responsible, would we find evidence sufficient to prosecute him? Body cam footage from a tactical officer approaching the cottage. It's dawn, Misty. The cottage looks peaceful, ordinary. A stone building with a slate roof and smoke curling from the chimney. Part 3. The cottage. Aerial footage of the tactical team surrounding the remote cottage. Officers in position with weapons drawn. Shernan's voice narrates over the scene. Dawn was breaking over the moorland as we approached the cottage. It was eerily beautiful, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the mist, illuminating the ancient landscape. It seemed impossible that such a serene setting could be connected to the darkness we were investigating. I hung back with the command team while armed officers approached the building. Standard procedure for a high-risk entry. We had no idea what we might find inside, whether Oliver was armed, whether there might be other people present, whether any of the missing women might possibly be alive and held there. Body camera footage shows officers approaching the front door, announcing police presence, then breaking down the door when there's no response. The cottage was empty. Or rather, Oliver Fletcher wasn't there. But what we did find made it immediately clear we were in the right place. Shernan walks through the cottage, pointing out details as camera follows. The main floor was ordinary enough: a small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, basic furniture. Nothing immediately suspicious. But in the bedroom, we found a laptop computer still running, as if Oliver had left in a hurry. And then there was the basement. Body camera footage of officers descending narrow stone stairs into darkness. Flashlight beams reveal a space that has been converted into something disturbing. Unlike the cozy cottage above, the basement had been transformed into a sterile, clinical space. The walls and floor were covered in white tile. There was a drain in the center of the floor. Metal shelving lined one wall, holding plastic containers, tools, chemicals. Another wall held a large cabinet that, when opened, revealed photography equipment, cameras, lights, tripods, and most disturbingly, one wall was covered entirely with photographs. Camera shows the photo wall, though the images themselves are blurred for viewers. Shernan stands before it, his expression grim. I want to be clear that I cannot show you the actual contents of these photographs. What I can tell you is that they documented Oliver Fletcher's crimes in explicit detail. Each of the 4 missing women appeared in multiple images, clearly showing they had been held captive in this basement and subjected to terrible abuse before their deaths. There were other women as well, faces we didn't recognize from any missing persons reports in our database. The photographs were meticulously labeled with names, dates, and locations, suggesting that Oliver had been killing for far longer than we had realized, and across a much wider geographical area. Shernan sitting at his desk, looking haunted. This is the part of the job that changes you. Standing in that basement, looking at the evidence of so much suffering, knowing that the monster responsible was still out there, it's a weight you carry forever. I've seen many crime scenes in my career, but nothing that matched the calculated, documented cruelty we found in that cottage. The forensic teams worked methodically, gathering evidence, documenting everything. The laptop was secured for analysis by our cybercrime specialists, and most critically, we began the grim process of searching the surrounding moorland for remains. Aerial footage shows search teams with dogs spreading out across the misty moorland. Oliver had chosen his location carefully. The cottage was surrounded by miles of peat bog treacherous terrain where bodies could be concealed and decompose without detection, perfect for hiding his victims. But he had made one critical mistake. In his arrogance, in his belief that he would never be caught, he had kept trophies, records, proof of what he'd done. Perhaps he enjoyed revisiting his crimes through these artifacts. Perhaps it was simply the compulsion of a disordered mind to document and organize. Whatever the reason, he had left us a roadmap to his guilt. Footage of forensic teams examining the basement. A technician calls Shernan over to look at something they've found under a loose tile. 3 days into the search, we found the first body buried on the property. It wasn't one of our 4 Derby women. It was someone new, someone whose disappearance hadn't been connected to our investigation. Dental records would later identify her as Melissa Langton, a 26-year-old who had gone missing from Sheffield 2 years earlier. Over the following week, we recovered 6 more bodies from various locations around the cottage. Eliza Morgan, Natalie Wells, and Charlotte Davies were among them. Emma Richardson, the most recent victim, was not suggesting that Oliver had disposed of her body elsewhere or was still in the process of his ritualized killing when our investigation forced him to flee. Shernan, standing by a police cordon as body bags are carried from the scene. I've thought a lot about what to tell you regarding the condition of the remains we found. There's a fine line between providing the truth about these crimes and indulging in the kind of gruesome sensationalism that disrespects the victims and their families. What I will say is this: Oliver Fletcher's crimes were methodical, prolonged, and showed evidence of escalating violence over time. The women had not died quickly or easily. As the evidence mounted, so did the pressure to locate Oliver Fletcher himself. Map showing potential escape routes from the Peak District. We established roadblocks on all major routes from the area, circulated his description to transportation hubs, and monitored financial transactions linked to his various aliases. The laptop provided additional information, emails, search history, accounts we hadn't previously known about, but Oliver had planned for this contingency. He had multiple false identities, offshore accounts, escape routes. He was technically sophisticated and pathologically careful. The one thing he hadn't anticipated was his mother's willingness to give him up. Interview room footage. James Fletcher sits across from Shernan, looking shell-shocked. "I knew Ollie had issues," James said quietly. "But this? I never imagined anything like this." "Did you have any contact with him after we spoke to you?" I asked. James hesitated, then nodded. "He called me the night after you questioned me. He wanted to know exactly what you'd asked, what you knew. I told him you were connecting him to the missing women. He laughed, actually laughed, said you had nothing solid, or you'd have arrested him already. Did he tell you where he was? No. But he said he'd been preparing for this day for years. That he had a plan. That by the time you figured anything out, he'd be gone. Gone where?" James shook his head. He didn't say, but there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. A kind of excitement? Like he was enjoying it all. That's when I started to think that maybe he really did do those terrible things. I studied James carefully. "Why didn't you call us immediately after that conversation? I was scared," he admitted. "Scared of being wrong and destroying my brother's life over nothing. Scared of being right and having to face what that meant. And scared of him. For the first time in my life, I was actually afraid of my own brother. I believed him. Whether that makes me naive or simply human, I don't know. But I believed that James had been caught in an impossible position, suspecting the worst about someone he loved, but unable to bring himself to accept it fully until forced to by overwhelming evidence." Shernan narrating over footage of international police cooperation. Interpol notices. Border alerts. The hunt for Oliver Fletcher became one of the largest manhunts in recent British history. His photograph was circulated internationally. Every port, airport, and border crossing was alerted. His known aliases were flagged in systems worldwide. For 2 weeks, there was nothing. No sightings, no financial activity, no digital footprint. It was as if he had simply vanished. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in December, we got our first lead. CCTV footage from a ferry terminal in Portsmouth, showing a man resembling Oliver boarding a ferry to France. This grainy image, captured 3 days after our raid on the cottage, showed someone who resembled Oliver boarding a ferry to Cain, France, using what we later confirmed was one of his false identities. By the time we identified this crossing, he was long gone, but it gave us a direction: continental Europe. The French authorities joined the investigation, reviewing their own CCTV networks and border crossing records. A week later, they identified a possible match at a train station in Lyon, boarding a train to Switzerland. Maps showing the suspected movement of Oliver Fletcher across Europe. We were always one step behind him. From Switzerland to Italy, from Italy to Slovenia. Each time, the trail would go cold for days before another possible sighting emerged. Shernan standing at a window, looking out at rain. Have you ever chased a shadow? That's what it felt like. We would catch glimpses of Oliver's presence, a credit card transaction using an alias we hadn't known about. Security footage too blurry to be definitive proof, but suggestive enough to keep us moving in a particular direction. Each time we thought we were closing in, he would disappear again. Meanwhile, the evidence against him continued to mount. Analysis of the laptop revealed not only records of his crimes, but extensive research on avoiding capture, evading extradition, and countries with limited cooperation with British law enforcement. Footage of forensic technicians examining the laptop. Oliver had been planning his escape for years, setting up infrastructure, establishing identities, creating financial safety nets. This wasn't a panic response to our investigation. This was a carefully constructed contingency plan being executed with precision. Camera returns to Shernan, now sitting in his office surrounded by case files. 3 months into the manhunt, with resources stretched thin and leads drying up, we received news that would change everything. A body had been discovered in a remote area of the Serbian countryside by a local farmer. The man had apparently died from exposure after attempting to cross difficult terrain in winter conditions. He carried identification that, while fake, matched one of the aliases we had linked to Oliver Fletcher. Photographs of a Serbian morgue, exterior only. I flew to Serbia with a forensic team to confirm the identification. Dental records and DNA would eventually provide definitive proof, but I knew it was him the moment I saw the body. Oliver Fletcher had died trying to disappear. Whether you see that as justice or a missed opportunity for the legal system to hold him fully accountable is a matter of perspective. Shernan walking through the Derby police station, nodding to colleagues as he passes. Our focus shifted from capturing a killer to providing answers and closure to the families of his victims. The identification and recovery process continued. In total, we identified 15 victims spanning a period of nearly 20 years, far more than we had initially suspected. Emma Richardson's body was eventually found buried near a hiking trail in the Peak District, approximately 10 miles from Oliver's cottage. She had been his final victim. Shernan sitting down with Patricia and Michael Richardson, Emma's parents. Telling the families was the hardest part. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you help people process not just the loss of their loved one, but the horror of how that loss occurred? Did she suffer? Patricia Richardson asked me, her voice barely audible. The truth would have been unbearable for them. So I told them what they needed to hear, that the evidence suggested Emma had died quickly, that she likely hadn't known what was happening. It was the only mercy I could offer them. Shernan standing before the evidence board, now complete with photographs of all identified victims and a timeline of Oliver Fletcher's crimes. We were able to trace Oliver's evolution as a killer. His first victim appeared to be a 19-year-old student who disappeared in 1998 during his first year at university, the same period when he was reported for stalking. From there, his crimes escalated in frequency and sophistication. The vacant house on Derby Lane had indeed been his first dedicated killing site, used between 2003 and 2005 for at least 6 victims. After nearly being discovered when a neighbor reported a break-in, he abandoned that location and found new hunting grounds, eventually purchasing the remote cottage in 2015 for his most recent crimes. Margaret Fletcher, now looking much older than her years, sitting in her living room surrounded by packed boxes. Margaret Fletcher sold the family home on Derby Lane. She couldn't bear to live there anymore, knowing what her son had done, knowing that she had lived just doors away from where some of his crimes took place. She moved to a care facility in another city, under a different name, seeking anonymity and perhaps some measure of peace. I keep asking myself what I missed, she told me during our final interview. What signs I should have seen. Whether I could have prevented any of this if I'd just paid more attention. The people who do these things are very good at hiding their true nature, I told her. Even from those closest to them. He was my son, she said simply. I should have known. James Fletcher packing up his own apartment. James, too, sought a fresh start. The association with his brother's crimes had made his life in Derby untenable. He found a job in another part of the country, changed his surname, tried to begin again. Before he left, he helped us understand more about his brother's history, providing insights into Oliver's childhood that might explain, though never excuse, what he became. There were incidents when we were kids, he explained. Things I didn't think much of at the time. Ollie herding animals. Becoming fixated on certain girls at school. Our dad leaving affected him badly. He became more withdrawn, more secretive. But lots of kids have troubled childhoods and don't become monsters. Shernan walking through a memorial garden dedicated to the victims. 15 stone markers bear the names of those identified. The case was officially closed in late 2019. Oliver Fletcher was positively identified as the killer responsible for 15 murders over a 20-year period. His death in Serbia brought an end to the active investigation, though work continued to identify any additional victims who might be connected to him. The families of the victims created a memorial garden in Derby, a quiet place of reflection where each victim is remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. I visit sometimes to pay my respects and to remind myself why the work we do matters, even when it leads us into the darkest corners of human behavior. Shernan, sitting in his office, looking at the camera. You might be wondering what lessons can be drawn from such a terrible case. What could possibly be learned from such senseless violence and suffering? I've thought about this question extensively. After 30 years in law enforcement, 20 of them as a detective, I've seen the worst that humans can do to each other. And yes, there are lessons here, though they offer little comfort. First, trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it often is. Several of Oliver's victims had told friends they felt uncomfortable around him before agreeing to meet him again. Those friends later reported wishing they had encouraged them more strongly to stay away. Second, be aware that the most dangerous predators often appear completely normal. Oliver Fletcher was described by those who knew him casually as quiet, polite, unremarkable. He deliberately cultivated this ordinary appearance to avoid drawing attention to himself. Third, know that isolation is a predator's tool. Oliver always separated his victims from their support networks, meeting them in places where they were alone and vulnerable. Shernan standing at the window of his office, looking out at the city. But beyond these practical lessons, I think there's something more profound to be learned from cases like this. Something about the nature of evil and our response to it. Oliver Fletcher represented a kind of evil that's difficult for most people to comprehend, calculated, patient, seemingly without remorse or internal conflict. He killed, not in passion or desperation, but methodically, almost clinically, for his own gratification. In the face of such darkness, it would be easy to become cynical, to lose faith in humanity altogether. But what I choose to focus on instead are the other people involved in this case, the families who never gave up seeking answers, the witnesses who came forward with information, the officers who worked tirelessly to find the truth, and yes, even Margaret Fletcher, who ultimately chose justice over maternal loyalty. Camera follows Shernan as he walks through the Derby police station, greeting colleagues, reviewing cases on his desk. For every Oliver Fletcher in this world, there are thousands of people working to build, to heal, to protect. The darkness exists, yes, but it does not dominate unless we allow it to. In my years as a detective, I've learned that closure is often an illusion. The families of Oliver's victims will carry their loss forever, but truth matters. Justice matters, even when it's imperfect. And remembering matters most of all, remembering not just how these women died, but how they lived, what they dreamed of, who they loved, and who loved them. Final shot. Shernan placing flowers at the memorial garden. Eliza Morgan was studying to become a veterinarian. She loved animals and spent weekends volunteering at a local shelter. Natalie Wells was a talented artist whose paintings still hang in her parents' home. Her mother told me that Natalie could find beauty in the ordinary things most people never noticed. Charlotte Davies had been a nurse for 8 years. Her colleagues described her as someone who could calm the most frightened patient with her gentle presence. Emma Richardson was planning to run a marathon to raise money for cancer research in honor of her grandfather. These women were not just victims. They were people with full, rich lives that were cut short by someone who saw them as objects for his gratification. Remembering them as whole people, not just as names in a case file, is perhaps the most important thing we can do. Shernan looks directly at the camera. I've shared this case with you not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor those who were lost, and to perhaps help prevent similar tragedies in the future. If anything about this story has resonated with you, if it's made you more aware, more cautious, more determined to listen to your instincts, then perhaps some small good can come from such darkness. And if you find yourself in a situation that doesn't feel right, if someone's behavior raises those subtle alarm bells in your mind, please pay attention to that feeling. It might just save your life. For Detective Marcus Shernan, this is the Derby Lane case solved, but never truly closed. Because the ripples of violence continue long after the perpetrator is gone, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. Shernan walks away from the camera toward the memorial garden as the screen fades to black. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey. If you found value in this account, please consider sharing it with others who might benefit from these lessons. And remember to subscribe to my channel for more investigations into cases that have shaped my understanding of crime, justice, and human nature. Stay safe out there. The world can be a dangerous place, but knowledge, awareness, and community are our best tools for navigating that danger. Until next time, this is Detective Marcus Shernan, signing off. End. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to the Shernan YouTube channel for more true crime investigations and insights from my decades in law enforcement. Your support helps me continue sharing these important stories and the lessons they contain. Remember, stay aware, trust your instincts, and look out for one another. Sometimes, the most important evidence is the feeling that something isn't quite right.